My ex turned my Uber ride into a nightmare. I broke up with my ex Nathan several weeks ago after he showed up to my work and destroyed my workspace because I didn't reply fast enough and made him feel ignored. His exact words. Along with all the other controlling things he did, it just didn't make any sense to stay with him. So I left. I moved in with my friend across town and thought I'd never have to deal with him again. That is until 2 weeks ago when I requested a ride to work. Guess who accepted it? My ex. He pulled up in his car with a huge smile on his face. The whole ride was so awkward. He kept saying things like, "Maybe this is fate bringing us back together," and "The universe works in mysterious ways." I just wanted to get out of the car. I didn't want to seem paranoid or make a big deal out of it. It was probably just bad luck, right? Wrong. It happened again a few days later. I was running late to my friend's birthday dinner and thought I was lucky when a driver immediately accepted my ride. But when I saw the car that pulled up, I froze. It was my ex Nathan again. This time, he took a wrong turn, by accident, and spent the entire extended ride asking me invasive questions like, "Are you seeing anyone now? Where are you headed to in such a hurry? Is it for a date?" I answered each one as calmly as I could and made sure to report him to the app after. But nothing seemed to happen because I met my ex again at the worst possible time. I had gone out on a date with an incredibly kind guy. But when he called an Uber for me, Nathan showed up again and actually got out of the car just to shake hands with my date and tell him, "Just so you know, she and I are getting back together, so this little date doesn't count." My date looked incredibly uncomfortable and completely ghosted me that night. After that, I started using a different rideshare app thinking maybe that would help. It didn't. My ex somehow kept appearing as my driver on that platform too. He'd make comments about my destinations like, "Oh, your mom's house again," or "New gym, huh?" I couldn't help but think, how? How was he always around? Nathan even started giving rides to coworkers and friends, constantly asking questions about me that scared them away from me too. I was seriously freaked out. I stopped going out. I declined invitations to important events, all because I was genuinely afraid of seeing my ex again. But one night, when I saw his car pass by through the window on a day I didn't even plan on going out, I knew this had to stop. I started researching and found out my ex was registered on multiple rideshare platforms at the same time, giving him a chance to find me even if I switched apps. I talked to some mutual acquaintances and learned that my ex had been declining other ride requests to stay in my general area, literally waiting for me to ping a ride. I even found an online post where my ex talked about winning back love through persistence, explaining how staying positive and finding ways to naturally run into your ex was key. He encouraged other men to do the same, and honestly, I felt sick just reading it. But the most disturbing part of it all was how 3 other people my ex dated before me had filed similar complaints with rideshare companies, and nothing had ever been done about it because of lack of evidence. But I wasn't going to be another victim. I documented everything I found. I went through my history, took screenshots of every ride where my ex was the driver, took down statements. But it wasn't enough. I needed proof. My lawyer and I came up with a brilliant plan. I scheduled a ride to a random address about 40 minutes away in the suburbs at a vacant lot. Other than workers at a nearby facility, there was absolutely no reason for me to be there. And it was so far out of his usual area that if he showed up, it only meant one thing: stalking. My lawyer drove me to a spot outside of the vacant lot, just near enough where we could watch without getting spotted. About 10 minutes later, my ex's car pulled up to that vacant lot, circling around in his car like a vulture clearly looking for me. My lawyer made sure everything was recorded, and after a couple of minutes, we took all the evidence to the police. What I didn't expect was the other insane things Nathan had been caught up in once they opened the investigation. The police subpoenaed the rideshare companies for data and found that my ex had been accessing back-end systems, using an employee dashboard to track my rides, selling access to other stalkers online. Both rideshare companies permanently banned him and the others. But then they found out what he did to another poor girl. The charges should have piled up, gotten him locked up, but unfortunately legal loopholes saved him. He was back. The next morning, I sat in Sloane's office with my hands shaking so bad I had to put them under my legs. She spread papers across her desk and started explaining how Nathan managed to walk free despite everything we proved. Something about the charges being filed wrong at first. Some detail about the back-end access not technically being illegal under current laws because the rideshare companies gave employees that access. The probation and community service felt like a joke after what he did. Sloane's jaw was tight when she told me the rideshare bans meant nothing if Nathan was still out there. She said we needed to go after him with a civil lawsuit since the criminal system failed us. I just kept thinking about how I'd see his car again, how he'd find new ways to track me. Camilla met me at the apartment that afternoon and insisted I stay home from work for a few days. She wanted me to hide, basically, but I refused to let Nathan control my life anymore. I called the roommate and asked if she could drive me to the office every day for a while. She agreed, but I could hear the worry in her voice. We started taking different routes each morning, and I watched every single car behind us like Nathan might appear any second. At work, my boss pulled me aside after a meeting because I kept checking my phone and looking out the windows. I had to explain why I couldn't focus, why I jumped every time someone walked past my desk. She was understanding, but I saw the concern on her face. 2 days later, the HR representative called me in for a meeting about workplace safety. I walked into her office expecting her to tell me this was a personal problem I needed to handle on my own. Instead, she took out a notepad and asked me to explain everything. I told her about Nathan, about the stalking, about him walking free. She didn't dismiss me or act like I was overreacting. We printed out Nathan's photo from my phone, and she personally walked it down to building security with instructions to call the police immediately if he showed up. Then she arranged for me to the park in the secure underground garage instead of the regular lot. For the first week, she even escorted me to my car every evening, walking with me through the dim concrete space and waiting until I drove away. Sloan called me into her office again the following week with a thick stack of papers. She'd filed a civil lawsuit against Nathan and both rideshare companies. The lawsuit cited negligence, emotional distress, and invasion of privacy. She showed me the filing fees and lawyer costs, and my stomach dropped at the numbers. But then she told me she was working partially pro bono because she was genuinely angry about how the system failed. We were also pursuing a long-term protective order that would last longer than the temporary one. She said it might take months, but we had a strong case. I signed everywhere she pointed and tried not to think about how much money this was costing me, even with her discount. Sebastian called my cell 3 days later while I was at work. The police had gotten a warrant for Nathan's devices and found evidence he'd been selling back-end access to at least 4 other stalkers online. He explained that Nathan had been running some kind of business, teaching other creeps how to track their victims through rideshare apps. The charges might get upgraded based on this new evidence, but Sebastian couldn't promise anything because the prosecutor's office had too many cases. I felt sick knowing Nathan turned stalking into a way to make money while I was just trying to get to work safely. Sebastian said he'd keep me updated, but I shouldn't get my hopes up about quick action. I was walking to my car in the parking garage 2 days later when I noticed a silver sedan parked 3 spaces down from mine. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat just waiting there. My heart started racing, and I immediately turned around and walked back toward the building. I pulled out my phone and called security while moving fast toward the elevator. By the time the security guard got down to the garage, the car was gone. I couldn't even confirm it was Nathan or his car. The guard walked me to my vehicle anyway and followed me out of the garage in his golf cart. The fear was so tiring, always wondering if he was watching. That night, I thought I heard someone trying the door handle to our apartment. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, and I froze when I heard the sound. My chest got tight, and I couldn't breathe right. I locked the bathroom door and sat on the floor trying to calm down. Camilla found me there 20 minutes later having a full panic attack. It turned out it was just the roommate coming home, but I was so on edge that every noise felt like a threat. Camilla sat with me on the bathroom floor and gently suggested I talk to someone professional about the anxiety. I finally admitted I couldn't keep living like this without help. She found a therapist who specialized in stalking victims and made me an appointment for the next week. The therapist's office was in a quiet building across town. She had me sit in a comfortable chair and asked me to describe what brought me in. I told her everything about Nathan, about the constant fear, about jumping at every sound. She explained that what I was experiencing was called hypervigilance, and it was a normal response to being stalked. We worked on grounding techniques for when panic hit, like focusing on 5 things I could see and 4 things I could touch. She taught me strategies for reclaiming small pieces of normalcy, like going to the grocery store during busy hours when I felt safer. The best part was when she validated that my fear was rational given Nathan's pattern. Somehow that made it easier to manage, knowing I wasn't crazy for being scared. The mom called me crying 3 days after my first therapy session. Someone had contacted her workplace claiming to be doing a background check on me for a job application. The caller asked invasive questions about my relationships and my mental health. My mom's boss pulled her aside after and expressed concern about family drama affecting her work. I was so mad I could barely speak. Nathan was expanding his harassment to my family now, trying to mess up my mom's job. I called Sloan immediately, and she told me to have my mom write down everything she remembered about the call. Sloan said this was perfect evidence for the protective order hearing because it showed Nathan was trying to harm me through my family. Sebastian called me the next morning and asked me to come down to the station. He had security footage from my office building that he wanted me to review. I sat in a small room with him and watched grainy video of the street outside my work. He pointed at the screen and I saw Nathan's car circling the block. The timestamp showed it was from last Tuesday. Then he showed me footage from Thursday and Monday, all showing the same thing. Nathan's car driving past my building multiple times, slowing down, circling back. The timestamps matched exactly with days when I felt like someone was watching me. Seeing the proof was both good and scary at the same time. Sebastian assured me this strengthened our case a lot, but all I could think about was how I just wanted Nathan to stop. A few days later, I was scrolling through social media on my phone when a message request popped up from Brooklyn. My stomach dropped because I hadn't heard from her since that awful night when Nathan showed up and ruined our date. I opened the message and she had written this long apology explaining how scared she was after Nathan's confrontation and how she didn't know how to handle the situation. She said she felt terrible about ghosting me and wanted to make things right by providing a statement about what Nathan said that night. I typed back immediately thanking her because her testimony about his claim that we were getting back together would show how messed up his thinking was. We arranged to meet for coffee that weekend at a place near her apartment. When I walked into the coffee shop, she was already sitting at a corner table looking nervous. She stood up and gave me a quick hug before we sat down. Brooklyn started talking fast about how she couldn't stop thinking about that night and how wrong it felt to just disappear on me. I told her I understood and that I was just grateful she was willing to help now. She pulled out her phone and showed me the notes she had written down about everything Nathan said and did that night. The details were so clear and specific that I knew they would be really helpful for Sloane's case. We talked for about an hour, and she seemed genuinely supportive, asking how I was holding up and if there was anything else she could do. But I could also tell she was relieved that Nathan had focused on me instead of turning his attention to her. When we said goodbye, she hugged me again and made me promise to keep her updated. I drove home feeling thankful for her help, but also a little sad that our potential friendship had been destroyed by Nathan's actions. 2 weeks later, I sat in a cold courtroom waiting for the protective order hearing to start. Sloane was next to me organizing papers while my mom sat in the row behind us for support. Then Nathan walked in with his lawyer, and I felt my whole body tense up. It was the first time I had been in the same room with him since everything happened, and I could feel his eyes on me even though I refused to look at him. The judge came in and everyone stood up before sitting back down. Nathan's lawyer went first, trying to paint him as just a heartbroken guy who made some poor choices because he loved me so much. He kept using words like misguided and desperate and tried to make it sound romantic instead of scary. Then it was Sloane's turn, and she was amazing. She walked the judge through the vacant lot sting operation, showing the video of Nathan circling around looking for me in a place I had no reason to be. She presented the evidence about the back-end system access and how Nathan had been tracking my rides illegally. Then she brought up the 3 previous victims who had filed complaints about Nathan doing the exact same thing to them. The judge's face got more serious with each piece of evidence Sloane showed. When Sloane finished, Nathan's lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but the judge cut him off. She looked directly at Nathan and said his pattern of behavior was clear and concerning. Then she granted a 6-month protective order and warned Nathan that any violation would result in immediate arrest. Nathan's face went red, and I saw his hands grip the table in front of him. As we left the courtroom, I finally felt like someone in power was taking this seriously. 3 days after the hearing, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when a friend request notification came up. The account had a generic name like John Smith or something, and there was no profile picture at all. I clicked on the profile and saw it had been created that same day with 0 posts and 0 friends. My heart started racing because something felt wrong about it. Then I refreshed my photos page and saw that the account had started going through and liking my old pictures from years ago. Pictures from college and family vacations and random selfies I had posted forever ago. I immediately started taking screenshots of everything, the profile name, the likes, the timestamps. Then I blocked the account and called Sloane right away, even though it was almost 10 at night. She answered and I told her what happened. Sloane said this was exactly the kind of thing she expected Nathan to do. She explained that he was probably testing boundaries to see what he could get away with without technically violating the protective order. Since the account wasn't directly messaging me or threatening me, he probably thought it was a gray area. Sloane told me to send her all the screenshots and she would add them to our documentation. After we hung up, I couldn't fall asleep for hours because I kept thinking about Nathan sitting somewhere creating fake accounts just to watch me. The next week, I was at the grocery store trying to do normal things like a normal person. I had a cart half full of food and was walking down the cereal aisle when I saw someone at the far end who looked exactly like Nathan. Same height, same build, same hair color. My breath caught and I abandoned my cart right there in the middle of the aisle. I walked as fast as I could toward the exit without running because I didn't want to cause a scene. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely get my keys out of my purse. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to calm down. My chest felt tight and I couldn't catch my breath properly. After a while, I realized it probably wasn't even Nathan because why would he risk violating the protective order just to shop at the same grocery store? It was probably just some random guy who happened to look similar. But my body didn't care about logic. I was still shaking when I finally drove home. At my next therapy session, I told the therapist about the false alarm, and she said this was completely normal for someone who had been through what I experienced. She called it hypervigilance and explained that my brain was trying to protect me by seeing threats everywhere. We worked on reality-checking strategies like taking a breath and looking for specific identifying features before assuming someone is Nathan. She taught me to ask myself questions like, can I see his face clearly? Or am I just seeing someone with similar hair? It helped a little, but I still felt jumpy every time I went out in public. A few days later, Nolan called me out of nowhere. We had mutual friends but weren't super close, so I was surprised to see his name on my phone. I answered, and he sounded really uncomfortable. He said he needed to tell me something about Nathan that had been bothering him for weeks. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near his work the next day. When I got there, Nolan was already sitting down looking guilty about something. He started talking before I even fully sat down. He told me that months ago, back when Nathan and I were still together, Nathan had asked him detailed questions about my daily routine. Nathan claimed he wanted to surprise me with flowers at my work and needed to know the best time to show up. Nolan thought it was romantic at the time, so he told Nathan what he knew about my schedule. Now, after everything that happened, Nolan realized he had been unknowingly helping Nathan stalk me. He looked like he might cry while he was telling me this. I could see he felt terrible about it. I told him it wasn't his fault because Nathan was good at manipulating people and making his creepy behavior seem normal. Nolan asked if there was anything he could do to help now, and I said I would talk to Sloane about him giving a statement. We finished our coffee and he apologized 3 more times before we left. I felt bad for him because I knew Nathan had fooled a lot of people. I called Sebastian as soon as I got home and told him about Nolan's information. Sebastian said he would follow up on it right away. 2 days later, Sebastian called me back with news. He had contacted multiple people in our mutual friend group and discovered that Nathan had been systematically questioning all of them about my schedule and habits. He had asked different people different questions, so no one realized he was collecting information. One friend told Sebastian that Nathan asked about my gym schedule. Another said Nathan asked what time I usually left work. Someone else said Nathan asked about my favorite restaurants and coffee shops. Most of them thought Nathan was just trying to win me back with romantic gestures. They had no idea they were feeding information to someone who was stalking me. Sebastian explained that this was really important evidence because it showed premeditation. Nathan hadn't just randomly started following me. He had spent months planning and gathering information. Sebastian said this kind of systematic behavior could upgrade the charges from harassment to felony stalking. He was documenting all of it and adding witness statements to the case file. I felt sick knowing how much effort Nathan had put into tracking me. It wasn't some impulsive mistake like his lawyer tried to claim. It was calculated and planned. The next week, Sloan called me sounding annoyed. She said the rideshare company's lawyers had sent her aggressive letters claiming they had no liability in my case. The letters threatened to countersue for legal fees if we continued pursuing them. I started to panic thinking we might have to drop that part of the case, but Sloan told me not to worry. She said corporate intimidation tactics were completely standard when companies got caught doing something wrong. She had already drafted a response with detailed evidence of their negligent security practices and all the previous complaints they had ignored. Sloan walked me through the evidence she was sending them, including internal emails and complaint records. She sounded almost excited about it, like she enjoyed fighting back against their threats. She told me we weren't backing down no matter how much they tried to scare us. After we hung up, I felt a little better knowing Sloan wasn't intimidated, but I was still worried about how much this was all costing. Sloan kept saying not to think about the money right now, but I couldn't help it. A week later, I was working late at my office trying to catch up on everything I had fallen behind on. It was almost 7 at night and most people had already gone home. My desk phone rang and I saw it was building security calling. The guard told me someone had tried to deliver flowers to my office, but they turned them away per the safety protocol we had set up. He said the delivery person claimed the sender was anonymous. But when security looked at the card attached to the flowers, it mentioned specific details about our relationship that only Nathan would know. Things like inside jokes and memories from when we dated. The guard kept the flowers in the security office as evidence and took photos of everything, including the card. I thanked him and immediately called Sebastian. He said he would come by the next morning to collect the flowers and add this to the growing file of protective order violations. After I hung up, I packed up my stuff and left even though I had more work to do. I didn't feel safe being there alone anymore. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors to make sure no one was following me. That weekend, Camilla asked if we could talk, and I knew from her tone it was serious. We sat down at the kitchen table and she said we needed to discuss how my situation was affecting the household. I felt my stomach drop. She explained that the roommate had been avoiding common areas when I was home because the constant security concerns and police visits made her uncomfortable. I hadn't even noticed, but apparently the roommate had been spending most of her time in her bedroom or going out. I immediately offered to move out because I didn't want to burden them with my problems. But Camilla cut me off and said absolutely not. She said we were going to figure this out together. Instead of me leaving, we spent the rest of the afternoon establishing new security measures. We called a locksmith to come change all the locks the next day. We ordered a camera doorbell that would record anyone who came to the door. Camilla even suggested we set up a check-in system where we would text each other when we got home safely. I was so grateful for her loyalty and support, but I also felt guilty about everything she was dealing with because of me. She kept insisting it was fine, but I could see the stress in her face. That night, I lay in bed feeling thankful for her friendship, but also like I was ruining her life. The following Tuesday, my therapist told me about a support group for stalking victims that met every week. She thought it might help me to talk to other people who understood what I was going through. I was nervous about going, but I agreed to try it. The group met in a community center conference room, and there were about 8 people sitting in a circle when I arrived. The facilitator welcomed me and asked if I wanted to share. I gave a brief overview of my situation with the rideshare stalking. As I talked, I could see other people nodding like they understood. After I finished, one woman spoke up and said she had been dealing with her stalker for 3 years, despite having multiple protective orders. She talked about how he kept finding ways around the legal system and how exhausting it was to constantly be vigilant. Her resilience was inspiring, but also really depressing because it made me realize this might never truly be over. Other people shared their stories too, and I felt less alone hearing that they dealt with the same fears and frustrations. When the meeting ended, several people came up to me and asked for Sloane's contact information for their own cases. I wrote down her number for them and we exchanged phone numbers to stay in touch. Driving home, I felt a weird mix of sad and hopeful. Sad that so many people were going through similar things, but hopeful that maybe together we could actually change something. A few days later, my phone rang while I was at work, and the caller ID showed Keith Wagner from the prosecutor's office. I stepped into an empty conference room and answered. He apologized for taking so long to get back to me, but explained his caseload was completely overwhelming. He said stalking cases usually get pushed to the bottom unless there's actual physical violence involved. I felt frustrated hearing that, but he quickly added that the new evidence we'd collected was strong enough to upgrade Nathan's charges. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to go over everything. When I hung up, I felt relieved that we were finally moving forward, even though the system seemed designed to ignore cases like mine, until something really bad happened. That evening, I was driving home from the grocery store when I noticed a dark blue sedan in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after about 5 minutes, I realized it was still behind me. I turned left onto a side street, and the sedan turned left too. My heart started beating faster. I made another turn into a residential neighborhood, and the car followed again. I grabbed my phone and called 911 while keeping my eyes on the road. The operator answered, and I explained that a car had been following me for about 10 minutes through multiple turns. She stayed on the line with me and told me not to go home. She gave me directions to the nearest police station, which was about 6 blocks away. I drove carefully, checking my mirrors constantly. The sedan stayed behind me for another few blocks, but then suddenly turned off onto a different street about 2 blocks before I reached the station. I pulled into the police station parking lot and sat there shaking. An officer came out to take my report, and I described the car and the route we'd taken. I couldn't see the license plate clearly, and I couldn't confirm it was Nathan driving, but the officer told me I'd done exactly the right thing by not going home and coming straight to the station. He filed a report and said they'd increase patrols in my neighborhood. The next morning, Sebastian called with an update that made my stomach turn. They'd identified 2 of the other stalkers Nathan had sold back-end access to, and both were now under investigation. One of them had been using Nathan's rideshare tracking system to stalk his ex-wife, even though he had a protective order against him. The guy had been monitoring her movements through the rideshare apps and showing up at places she went. Sebastian explained that this would really strengthen our criminal case because it showed Nathan wasn't just stalking me, he was enabling other people to stalk their victims for money. I felt sick knowing Nathan had turned this into some kind of business. Sebastian assured me that the prosecutor would use this information to push for more serious charges. 2 days later, Sloan called and asked if I could come to her office that afternoon. When I got there, she had papers spread across her desk, and she looked both excited and concerned. One of the rideshare companies had sent a settlement offer. The number was substantial, enough to cover all my legal fees and therapy costs with plenty left over. But there was a catch. The settlement included a strict NDA that would prevent me from ever discussing their security failures publicly. Sloan explained that accepting the money would help me financially, but it might also prevent other victims from learning about what happened and how dangerous these apps could be. She said the decision was ultimately mine, but I needed to think carefully about whether justice or money mattered more right now. I asked for a few days to think about it because I genuinely didn't know what to do. The money would change my life, but staying silent felt like betraying all the other victims. 3 days later, I was at work when my boss came to find me looking worried. Building security had just called to report that Nathan tried to enter the lobby. He told the security guard he had a delivery for someone on the 3rd floor. The guard refused to let him in and followed our safety protocol by calling the police immediately. By the time officers arrived, Nathan was already gone. My boss walked me down to security and they showed me the footage. There he was on camera, clear as day, trying to talk his way past the front desk. I felt my hands start shaking as I watched. The security supervisor made copies of the footage and I called Sebastian right away. He told me to send him everything and said he'd file for an emergency protective order violation hearing. This was exactly the kind of thing the judge had warned Nathan about. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, and I had to take time off work to attend. I sat in the courtroom with Sloan while the judge reviewed the security footage on a screen. Nathan's lawyer stood up and claimed it was an honest mistake, that Nathan had forgotten which building I worked in, and was just trying to deliver something to a friend. The judge looked at him like he was insulting her intelligence. She pointed out that Nathan had specifically mentioned the 3rd floor, and had tried to convince security to let him up. She extended the protective order from 6 months to 2 full years, and told Nathan directly that the next violation would result in immediate jail time. I felt a small rush of victory, but I also knew Nathan would just find more creative ways to get around the rules. He always did. The following week, Sloan called to say that someone named Gianna Dorsey had reached out through her office. Gianna said she was one of Nathan's previous victims and wanted to support my case. Sloan had already verified her story and suggested we meet. I agreed, and we set up lunch at a quiet restaurant across town. Gianna was in her early 30s with kind eyes that looked tired. We sat down and she immediately started sharing her experience. Nathan had stalked her through rideshare apps about 2 years ago using the exact same methods. She'd filed multiple complaints with both companies, but nothing ever happened. They'd told her there wasn't enough evidence and that it was probably just coincidence. She'd eventually moved to a different city just to get away from him. Hearing her story felt like looking in a mirror. Every detail matched what I'd been going through. She said she'd been following the news about my case and decided it was time to come forward publicly. She was willing to testify and speak to the media if needed. I felt this surge of hope that maybe together we could actually force these companies to change their policies and prevent this from happening to other people. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. A week later, I took my car in for routine maintenance at the shop I'd been using for years. About an hour after I dropped it off, the mechanic called. He asked if I knew there was a GPS tracker attached under my rear bumper. Everything went cold. I asked him to repeat what he'd just said. He explained that while doing the inspection, he'd noticed a small device magnetically attached to the underside of the car near the back wheel. It looked like a GPS tracker. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told him not to touch it and called Sebastian immediately. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes and told me to stay at the shop. When Sebastian arrived, he put on gloves and carefully removed the device. He held it up and showed me how small it was, about the size of a deck of cards. He explained that this was a clear felony and would finally give us the serious charges we needed. Nathan hadn't just been tracking my rideshare requests. He'd been tracking every single place I drove, every trip to the store, every visit to my mom's house, every drive to work. He'd known my exact location this entire time. The next day, I had to go to the police station to give a detailed statement about everywhere I'd driven over the past few months. Sitting in that interview room trying to remember every location felt like being violated all over again. Sebastian asked about specific dates and times, and I had to pull up my calendar to help remember. The grocery store, the gym, Camilla's apartment, my therapist's office, the support group meetings. Nathan had known about all of it. After the statement, I went straight to my therapist's office for an emergency session. She helped me process the anger and fear that was threatening to overwhelm me. She reminded me that each piece of evidence was building a stronger case, and that Nathan's actions were getting more and more serious in the eyes of the law. A few days later, Sebastian called with good news. They'd traced the tracker's purchase to an online account that was directly linked to Nathan's credit card. The purchase had been made 3 months ago, right around the time the protective order was first issued. This gave them clear proof of his intent to continue stalking me despite the court order. That same week, Sloan received a call from someone who wouldn't give their name, but said they worked for one of the rideshare companies. The person asked to meet in person, and Sloan agreed, but brought Sebastian along for safety. They met in a public park, and the whistleblower handed over a folder of internal documents. The papers showed that the company had known about back-end security problems for over a year. There were emails and reports detailing multiple complaints about drivers stalking passengers, but the company had ignored them or given weak responses. The documents proved that the company knew their system could be used this way, and they'd chosen not to fix it. Sloan called me that evening, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. This evidence showed clear corporate negligence and would make our civil case much stronger. The company couldn't claim they didn't know about the problem anymore, because we had their own internal documents proving they did. She said this changed everything about our lawsuit, and we finally had the proof we needed to hold them accountable. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. I grabbed it off the nightstand and saw dozens of messages from friends and coworkers. My stomach dropped when I opened the first one. Someone had created fake social media profiles using my photos and was posting really inappropriate stuff that made me look completely unstable. The posts were talking about mental breakdowns and making wild claims about my personal life. I scrolled through message after message from people asking if I'd been hacked or if I was okay. I felt sick. This was Nathan's newest way to hurt me. I had to spend the entire morning explaining to everyone that my stalker was trying to destroy my reputation. Some people believed me right away, but I could tell others weren't sure what to think. I called Sloan immediately, and she told me to screenshot everything before the profiles got taken down. I spent 2 hours documenting every single post and comment while my hands shook. Sebastian said he'd contact the social media companies to get the accounts removed, but warned me it could take days. By the time the profiles finally came down that afternoon, the damage already felt permanent. My coworkers had seen the posts. My boss had probably seen them. People I barely knew had screenshots. I couldn't stop thinking about how Nathan was systematically destroying every part of my life. 3 days later, my bank called about suspicious login attempts on my account from a device they didn't recognize. The security specialist on the phone explained that someone had my email address and was trying different password combinations to break in. I had to freeze everything immediately and spent an hour on the phone changing every single password I had. My hands were shaking so bad I kept typing the wrong letters. The specialist told me to check if any other accounts had been accessed, but everything else seemed okay for now. I hung up and just sat there feeling completely violated. Nathan had somehow gotten my personal information and was trying to steal my identity on top of everything else. I called Sebastian right away, and he added identity theft to the growing list of charges against Nathan. He sounded tired when he told me this was getting more serious but also more complicated. I asked him what that meant, and he said the criminal case was building, but these things take time. I wanted to scream that I didn't have more time. Nathan was destroying my life piece by piece while the legal system moved at a snail's pace. A week later, Keith finally called Sloan to set up a meeting. We all gathered in his office, and I sat between Sloan and Sebastian while Keith spread out folders of evidence across his desk. He looked at everything we'd collected over the past months: the GPS tracker, the back-end access records, the fake social media profiles, the identity theft attempts. Keith leaned back in his chair and said he was finally convinced we had enough for serious felony charges. He explained the process would take months, and Nathan would probably try to negotiate a plea deal to avoid trial. But the GPS tracker and the proof that Nathan had been selling stalking access to other people gave us really strong leverage. I felt exhausted just thinking about months more of this. Keith must have seen it on my face because he said he understood how hard this was, but that the criminal system was finally taking it seriously. Sloan squeezed my hand under the table. Sebastian nodded and said they'd keep building the case while we waited. I left that meeting feeling weird. Part of me was relieved that Keith believed us now, but another part of me was just so tired of fighting. That same week, someone from my support group gave my contact information to a journalist who'd been investigating rideshare safety problems. The journalist reached out through email asking if I'd be willing to share my story for a major publication. I I stared at that email for like an hour before calling Sloan. She thought public pressure might actually force the rideshare companies to make real changes to their systems, but I was terrified of the exposure. I talked to my therapist about it in our next session, and she helped me think through the pros and cons. Then I called Camilla and asked what she thought. She said if I felt strong enough to do it, then maybe it could help other people going through the same thing. After a few days, I emailed the journalist back and said I'd participate, but only if they could protect my identity somehow. The journalist said they could change my name and some identifying details while keeping the main story intact. I agreed and spent the next week doing phone interviews and sending over documentation. It felt strange talking about everything that happened to a complete stranger, but it also felt like maybe something good could come from all this pain. 2 weeks later, the article went live online. The headline was about how rideshare companies were enabling stalkers, and my case was featured really prominently alongside Gianna's story and 2 other victims I didn't know. They changed my name in the article but included enough details that anyone who knew me would probably recognize the story. I sat at my desk at work refreshing the page and watching the comments pile up. Hundreds of people were sharing their own experiences with stalkers using rideshare apps. People were demanding that the companies be held accountable. Some comments were from other victims thanking us for speaking up. The response was completely overwhelming. I had to close my laptop and go sit in the bathroom for a while because I couldn't stop crying. When I came back to my desk, I had messages from friends who'd figured out it was me. Most of them were supportive. A few seemed uncomfortable. I realized there was no going back from this. My story was out there now for everyone to see and judge. The next day, Sloan called me sounding really satisfied. She said Nathan's lawyer had contacted her in a total panic. The article had generated so much negative attention that they wanted to negotiate a settlement to make everything go away quietly. Sloan told them we weren't interested in protecting Nathan's reputation, and that he should focus on preparing for the criminal trial instead. I felt this surge of satisfaction hearing that. For once, Nathan was the one facing consequences and public scrutiny instead of me. His lawyer apparently tried to argue that the article was unfair and one-sided, but Sloan shut that down fast. She reminded them that everything in the article was documented fact backed up by police reports and court records. After she hung up with them, she called me and I could hear the smile in her voice. She said this was exactly the kind of pressure we needed. Nathan couldn't hide behind legal delays anymore. Everyone knew what he'd done. But that satisfaction didn't last long. 2 days after the article published, someone posted my real name and workplace in the comments section. Suddenly, I was getting flooded with messages from complete strangers. Most of them were offering support and sharing their own stalking stories. But some of the messages were blaming me for not leaving Nathan sooner, or questioning why I'd stayed with him at all. The attention became completely overwhelming. I couldn't keep up with all the notifications. I couldn't focus on anything else. I finally just deactivated all my social media accounts to make it stop. My boss called me into her office looking concerned. She said she was supportive of me, but worried about the disruption this was causing at work. Clients had been calling asking questions. Other employees were distracted by the drama. HR stepped in and arranged for me to work from home for a week while things calmed down. I felt awful about causing problems at my job on top of everything else. I packed up my desk stuff and drove home feeling like Nathan was still managing to ruin my life even from a distance. A few days into working from home, Sebastian called with news that made my heart race. He said Nathan had violated his probation by accessing rideshare apps through a friend's account. They had evidence showing he'd been searching for my name in the system. Sebastian explained that probation violations meant Nathan could be arrested immediately without having to wait for the criminal trial. I felt this weird mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that he'd finally face immediate consequences. Anxiety because I knew this would make him even angrier. Sebastian said officers were heading to Nathan's apartment right then to arrest him. I asked if I needed to do anything, and he said just stay home and stay safe. About an hour later, Sebastian called back to confirm Nathan had been arrested and was being held at the county jail pending a probation hearing. I hung up and just sat on the couch staring at nothing. Camilla came home from work and found me like that. I told her what happened and she hugged me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. The probation hearing happened way faster than I expected. Only 3 days after Nathan's arrest, we were all back in court. Nathan's lawyer stood up and argued that simply looking at a rideshare app wasn't the same as contacting me directly. He tried to say Nathan was just checking the app out of habit and hadn't actually done anything wrong. But the judge wasn't buying it. She looked at Nathan and said he'd been explicitly ordered to have no contact with me and no access to systems that could track my location. Accessing a rideshare app through someone else's account to search for my name was a clear violation of those terms. She revoked his probation right there. Then she sentenced him to 60 days in jail for the original charges plus the probation violations. It wasn't the years I wished he'd get. But knowing Nathan would be locked up for 2 months gave me the first real peace I'd felt in forever. I watched the officers put handcuffs on him and lead him out of the courtroom. His mom was crying in the back row. I didn't feel bad for either of them. I decided to use those 2 months while Nathan was locked up to focus on rebuilding my life without constant fear hanging over me. I went back to working normal hours at the office. I started accepting social invitations again instead of making excuses to stay home. Camilla and I had a girls' night where we actually laughed and watched movies without me jumping up to check the door every 5 minutes. It felt strange to relax. My therapist noticed the visible difference in my stress levels during our sessions. We worked on strategies for maintaining these coping mechanisms for when Nathan eventually got released. She reminded me that 60 days would go by fast, and I needed to be prepared. But for now, I was just trying to enjoy feeling safe in my own life again. I went to the grocery store without looking over my shoulder. I drove to my mom's house without checking if anyone was following me. I slept through the night without nightmares. It wasn't permanent peace, but it was enough for right now. About 3 weeks into Nathan's jail time, Sloan called me at work sounding excited in a way I hadn't heard before. She told me both rideshare companies had sent serious settlement offers that morning. The numbers were bigger than I expected. They were offering financial compensation that would cover all my legal fees and therapy costs with plenty left over. But the money wasn't even the best part. Both companies agreed to implement new safety features within 6 months. Panic buttons in the app, better background screening for drivers, a complete ban on drivers registering across multiple platforms at the same time. Sloan walked me through each policy change, and I could tell she was impressed by how specific and concrete their commitments were. Then she got to the problem. The settlement included a non-disclosure agreement, a strict one. I wouldn't be able to talk publicly about what the companies did wrong or how they failed to protect me and the other victims. Sloan said she understood if that was a deal breaker for me. I told her I needed time to think about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going back and forth in my head about whether taking their money meant giving up the fight for real change. Camilla listened to me talk through it for hours. She pointed out that getting the companies to actually fix their systems might be more valuable than my ability to trash them publicly. I wasn't sure. The next morning, I called Gianna. We talked for almost 2 hours about what the settlement would mean. She had been one of Nathan's previous victims, and she understood the anger I felt about the companies ignoring complaints for so long. But she also reminded me that 3 other victims had gotten nothing. No apology, no policy changes, no acknowledgement that the companies had failed them. If I could force these companies to implement real safety features, maybe I could prevent other people from going through what we did. I spent the whole week calling other victims I'd connected with through the support group. Most of them thought I should take the deal. A few were angry that I was even considering it. One woman told me I was selling out and letting the companies buy my silence. That hurt. But another victim pointed out that the safety features would protect thousands of people. She said my voice mattered, but protecting future victims mattered more. By the end of the week, I knew what I wanted to do. I called Sloan and told her to negotiate modifications to the NDA. I wanted language that would let me continue doing victim advocacy work without naming the companies specifically. I could still talk about stalking. I could still help other victims. I just couldn't publicly discuss these particular companies and their failures. Sloan went back to their lawyers and pushed hard on the NDA terms. It took another week of back and forth, but she got them to agree. The modified agreement let me do advocacy work and speak generally about technology stalking. I just couldn't name the companies or share internal documents. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like the right choice. The settlement was finalized about a month into Nathan's jail sentence. The payment hit my bank account on a Tuesday morning. 6 figures. More money than I'd ever seen at once. It covered every penny Sloan had billed me. It covered 6 more months of therapy. It gave me a financial cushion I'd never had before. But honestly, the money wasn't what made me feel good. Both companies signed binding agreements to hire independent security people to check their systems. They had to implement the panic buttons and new screening processes within 6 months. They had to report back on their progress. Sloan called it a big victory. She said most stalking cases end with restraining orders and nothing else. We'd actually forced 2 major companies to change how they operate. I let myself feel proud of that. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like maybe something good could come from all the fear and violation I'd experienced. Around the same time the settlement was wrapping up, Keith reached out about Nathan's criminal case. He asked me to come to his office to discuss a plea deal he was offering Nathan's lawyer. I met him on a Thursday afternoon and he laid out the terms. 3 years in prison for felony stalking. Additional charges for selling illegal access to private data. Identity theft charges from the fake social media profiles. Keith said Nathan's lawyer was trying to negotiate down to 1 year. He told me he wasn't budging. The GPS tracker evidence was too strong. The multiple victims made it impossible to claim this was just a misunderstanding. The data selling showed this was calculated and predatory. Keith seemed confident, but I could tell he was also being realistic with me. He said plea deals happen in most cases because trials are expensive and unpredictable. I asked him what would happen if Nathan rejected the deal. Keith said we'd go to trial and I'd have to testify about everything. The stalking, our relationship, every uncomfortable detail. I left his office feeling anxious about both possibilities. Part of me wanted Nathan to take the deal and just go to prison without me having to face him in court. But another part of me wanted him to reject it, so a jury could hear everything he did. 2 weeks later, Keith called with news. Nathan had rejected the plea deal. His lawyer filed paperwork demanding a trial. Keith said Nathan apparently thought he could win despite all the evidence against him. He seemed convinced a jury would see him as a heartbroken guy who made mistakes, not a predatory stalker who monetized his abuse. Keith warned me that trials are unpredictable. Juries sometimes surprise everyone. I'd have to testify in detail about the stalking and our relationship. Nathan's lawyer would try to make me look bad. They'd dig into my choices and my past. They'd try to make it seem like I was partly responsible or overreacting. I felt sick thinking about it. My therapist spent our next 3 sessions helping me prepare for what a trial would mean. She walked me through visualization exercises for staying calm while testifying. We practiced answering hostile questions without getting defensive. She reminded me that the truth was on my side, and I just had to tell it clearly. She also prepared me for the emotional impact of seeing Nathan in court and having my private life examined publicly. I was trying to focus on trial preparation when things got worse at work. I was at my desk going through emails when my boss called me into her office. She looked worried and uncomfortable. She turned her computer screen toward me and showed me an email that had been sent to the company's general inbox. The email had a fake name and contained this whole twisted version of events. It claimed I was lying about Nathan. It said I was trying to ruin his life for attention. It accused me of being unstable and vindictive. It suggested the company should be concerned about my mental state and judgment. My boss told me she didn't believe any of it. She said she knew what I'd been going through and the company supported me completely. But I could see doubt in her eyes. Just a flicker of it. Like maybe she was wondering if there was some truth to the claims. I was so mad I could barely speak. This was Nathan trying to destroy my reputation and my job. My boss said HR would investigate where the email came from. She told me not to worry. But I left her office shaking with anger and fear. HR moved fast on the investigation. They brought in their IT person to trace the email. Within 2 days, they had an answer. The email came from an IP address linked to Nathan's mother's house. That's where he'd been staying since his release from jail. HR documented everything and called me in for a meeting. They assured me my job was totally secure. They understood I was harassed. But then they suggested I might want to take FMLA leave during the trial for my mental health. The HR person said it gently, but I understood what she meant. The situation was affecting my work, and they were worried about me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to maintain normalcy and keep working like everything was fine. But I also knew I was barely holding it together. I was jumping at every notification on my phone. I couldn't focus in meetings. I was exhausted from the constant stress. I told HR I'd think about the leave option. Sloan was mad when I told her about the workplace email. She immediately filed additional civil claims against Nathan personally. Defamation. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. She based the claims on the fake social media profiles and now these workplace emails. Sloan explained we might never actually collect money from him. Nathan didn't have assets worth going after. But having court judgments on record would establish a legal history of his behavior. If he ever tried this stuff again with anyone else, there would be documentation. I appreciated how she was thinking long-term about protecting me from future problems. It felt good to have someone on my side who was planning 10 steps ahead. Keith called about a week later with the trial date, 3 months away. He asked me to come to his office so he could walk me through what to expect during testimony. I met him on a Monday and he spent 2 hours preparing me. He was confident about our evidence, the GPS tracker, the back-end access, the multiple victims, the protective order violations, all of it pointed to systematic stalking. But he also warned me that Nathan's lawyer would try to make me look vindictive. They'd argue our relationship was mutually bad. They'd suggest I was exaggerating or lying for attention. Keith had me practice answering the kinds of questions the defense would ask. Why did I stay with Nathan if he was so controlling? Why didn't I report the rideshare stalking sooner? Had I ever said anything mean about Nathan to mutual friends? The questions felt like attacks, but Keith said I needed to be ready. My therapist and I spent the next several sessions doing more preparation. She helped me understand that the defense's job was to create doubt. They'd twist my words and take things out of context. She taught me to pause before answering, to stick to simple facts, to not get pulled into emotional reactions. It was exhausting, but I knew I had to be ready. Then Nolan called me out of the blue. We hadn't talked much since he'd told me about Nathan questioning him months ago. He sounded apologetic and nervous. He said Nathan's lawyer had subpoenaed him as a witness. He had to testify about our mutual friend group. Nolan promised he would tell the truth about Nathan's manipulative questions and weird behavior. He said he'd make it clear that Nathan had been obsessed with tracking my movements. I thanked him for the warning and told him I appreciated his honesty. But I was worried about what Nathan's lawyer might do with his testimony. They could twist innocent details to make it seem like our friend group was dramatic, or that I'd been talking badly about Nathan. I tried not to think about all the ways the trial could go wrong, but it was hard not to spiral into worst-case scenarios. 2 months before the trial date, Sebastian called with a plan that made my stomach flip. He wanted to run a decoy operation using an undercover officer as bait in my usual area to see if Nathan would take it. I agreed immediately because I needed proof that Nathan was still actively looking for me despite the protective order. The officer, a woman around my age, requested a ride from a coffee shop I used to visit regularly. Sebastian had me stay at the police station while they ran the operation so I wouldn't accidentally be spotted. I sat in a small conference room watching the clock and picking at my cuticles until they bled. About 40 minutes later, Sebastian came in with his phone out showing me footage from the officer's body camera. Nathan had shown up in a borrowed car, a beat-up sedan I didn't recognize, and accepted the ride request. The officer got in and gave an address to a restricted parking area near an old warehouse, somewhere no regular passenger would actually want to go. Nathan followed the officer's directions without question and pulled into the lot. The footage showed him circling the area slowly, clearly looking for someone, looking for me. Sebastian had backup units waiting nearby and they moved in fast. Nathan was arrested right there for violating the protective order and his bail was immediately revoked. I watched the arrest footage 3 times, seeing Nathan's face go from confused to angry as officers put him in handcuffs. Sebastian told me Nathan would sit in jail until the trial now, and I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders knowing he couldn't follow me or track me or show up anywhere I went. Nathan's lawyer started filing motions almost immediately, trying to get evidence thrown out and delay the trial. Keith called me every few days with updates about the legal back and forth. The defense claimed the decoy operation was entrapment, that the GPS tracker evidence was obtained illegally, that the back-end access data violated Nathan's privacy somehow. Keith fought every single motion with detailed responses and case law, and the judge denied most of them. I could tell from Keith's tone that the judge was getting tired of the defense's stalling tactics. One motion tried to argue that Nathan's mental health issues should exclude certain evidence, but Keith shut that down by pointing out that Nathan had been calculating enough to sell tracking access to other stalkers for money. I was relieved Nathan was locked up, but the idea of testifying in detail about everything made me sick with nerves. My therapist and I did extra sessions preparing for the emotional impact of facing Nathan in court and having every detail of my private life examined by strangers. The trial started on a freezing Monday morning in early February. I wore a simple navy dress that Sloan helped me pick out. Nothing flashy or attention-grabbing. Camilla drove me to the courthouse and we met my mom, Sloan, and 3 people from my support group in the lobby. Their presence felt like armor around me as we went through security and found the courtroom. Nathan sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit looking thinner than I remembered, and when I walked in, his eyes locked onto me immediately. I forced myself to look away and focus on Keith instead. The jury filed in, 12 people who would decide if Nathan's behavior was criminal or just, as his lawyer would claim, the actions of a heartbroken man who went too far. Keith's opening statement was everything I hoped it would be. He laid out the timeline starting with Nathan's controlling behavior during our relationship, the workplace destruction that ended things, and then the systematic stalking through rideshare platforms. Keith explained how Nathan had exploited back-end systems to track my every movement, how he'd declined other ride requests to stay near me, how he'd followed me to a vacant lot 40 minutes outside his normal area. He showed the jury photos of the GPS tracker found on my car and explained how Nathan had sold similar tracking capabilities to other stalkers online for profit. Keith's voice was calm but firm as he described the pattern of behavior that showed calculation and intent, not heartbreak. Then Nathan's lawyer stood up for his opening and I wanted to scream. He painted Nathan as a man desperately in love who made poor choices trying to win me back. He claimed Nathan never meant to scare me, that he just wanted to stay connected and didn't understand boundaries. The lawyer's voice got emotional as he talked about how relationships end badly sometimes, and people do stupid things when they're hurting. I gripped Camilla's hand so hard my knuckles went white because I wanted to stand up and yell that love doesn't look like GPS trackers and reputation destruction and selling my location data to other abusers. I testified the next day, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Keith had prepared me well, but nothing could really ready me for sitting 15 feet from Nathan while describing his abuse. I spent 6 hours on the stand over 2 days walking the jury through our relationship. I explained how Nathan would get angry if I didn't text back within minutes, how he'd show up at my work unannounced to check on me, how he destroyed my workspace when I didn't respond fast enough one day. I described the terror of having him appear as my rideshare driver over and over, the sick feeling when I realized he was tracking my every movement. The defense attorney was aggressive during cross-examination, trying to make me look paranoid and dramatic. She asked why I stayed with Nathan if he was so controlling, why I didn't report the rideshare stalking to police sooner, whether I'd ever said mean things about Nathan to mutual friends. Keith had prepared me for these questions, so I stayed calm and stuck to facts. When I described finding the GPS tracker on my car, I saw several jury members' faces change, looking disturbed and angry. That gave me hope they understood this wasn't about a bad breakup. It was about a predator who used technology to terrorize me. The defense attorney tried one more time to suggest I was exaggerating, asking if maybe Nathan was just trying to make sure I got home safely when he tracked my rides. I looked her straight in the eye and said Nathan knew I wanted no contact. He knew about the protective order and he chose to violate my boundaries anyway, because what he wanted mattered more to him than my fear. Gianna took the stand after me, and her testimony destroyed the defense's heartbroken lover story. She described how Nathan had stalked her through rideshare platforms 2 years before me, using the exact same tactics. He'd registered on multiple apps, declined other rides to stay in her area, made comments about her destinations that proved he was tracking her movements. Gianna's voice shook as she explained how she'd filed complaints with both rideshare companies and nothing happened, how Nathan had only stopped when she moved to a different city. Then 2 other women who dated Nathan testified with similar stories. One described how Nathan had followed her to her gym and showed up at her sister's house uninvited. Another talked about finding suspicious charges on her phone bill from tracking apps she never installed. The pattern was so clear that Nathan's lawyer barely even tried to cross-examine them. What could she say when 3 different women described identical stalking behavior spanning 4 years? The jury looked at Nathan with visible disgust, and I felt validation I hadn't even known I needed. Sebastian testified the next day about the investigation and the technical evidence. He explained how police had subpoenaed the rideshare companies and found Nathan had accessed back-end employee systems to view my ride requests and locations in real time. Sebastian walked the jury through screenshots showing Nathan's login activity, the times he'd searched for my name, the data he'd downloaded about my movements. Then Sebastian dropped the bomb about Nathan selling access to these tracking capabilities to at least 4 other stalkers online. He showed the jury chat logs where Nathan explained his system and charged money for back-end credentials. Keith did a great job making the complicated technical stuff understandable, using charts and timelines that showed exactly how Nathan had turned stalking into a business. Nathan's lawyer tried to suggest the evidence was obtained improperly, or that someone else could have used Nathan's computer, but the judge shut down that questioning fast. Sebastian remained calm and professional throughout, and I could see the jury taking lots of notes during his testimony. The whistleblower from the rideshare company testified remotely with voice distortion to protect their identity. They explained how the companies had known about security holes in their back-end systems for over a year, but hadn't fixed them because it would cost too much money. The whistleblower provided internal emails showing multiple complaints about drivers stalking passengers that were ignored or inadequately addressed. They described how easy it was for drivers to access passenger data and how the companies prioritized driver recruitment over passenger safety. Keith asked specific questions about whether the companies knew their systems could be exploited for stalking, and the whistleblower confirmed they absolutely knew and chose not to act. Nathan's lawyer looked frustrated because they couldn't effectively challenge someone they couldn't identify or cross-examine properly. The defense tried to object multiple times, but the judge allowed the testimony because the whistleblower had provided authenticated documents, proving their employment and access to the information. Nathan's mother testified as a character witness, and it was painful to watch. She cried on the stand talking about what a good son Nathan was, how he'd always been sensitive and caring, how I must have misunderstood his intentions. She claimed Nathan had been devastated when I broke up with him, and was just trying to show me he still cared. Her testimony felt desperate and completely disconnected from reality, like she genuinely couldn't see what her son had become. I actually felt sorry for her living in such deep denial about Nathan's behavior. Keith's cross-examination was gentle but effective. He asked her if Nathan had ever had trouble accepting rejection before, and she admitted he'd been upset when previous girlfriends ended things. Keith asked if she knew Nathan had been arrested for violating a protective order, and she said yes, but claimed it was a misunderstanding. Keith asked if selling stalking capabilities to other abusers sounded like the behavior of a caring person, and she just cried harder without answering. Nathan testified in his own defense, and it was a complete disaster for him. His lawyer had clearly coached him to appear sympathetic and remorseful, but Nathan's entitlement kept showing through. He claimed he was just trying to stay connected to me because he loved me so much and didn't realize his behavior was wrong. He said the rideshare coincidences were fate bringing us together, and he'd only tracked my rides to make sure I was safe. Nathan actually said with a straight face that putting a GPS tracker on my car was protective, not invasive. The jury looked skeptical throughout his testimony, and things got worse during Keith's cross-examination. Keith walked Nathan through every violation of the protective order, every piece of evidence showing calculation and intent. Keith asked Nathan directly if he knew I wanted no contact, and Nathan had to admit yes. Keith asked if Nathan understood what a protective order meant, and Nathan said yes. Keith asked why Nathan chose to track my movements anyway, and Nathan's answer was chilling. He said he knew I'd come back to him eventually, and he just needed to be patient and stay present in my life until I realized we belonged together. Keith asked about selling back-end access to other stalkers, and Nathan tried to minimize it as just helping other guys who were going through tough breakups. The jury looked horrified, and Nathan's lawyer looked like she wanted to disappear. Closing arguments happened on Friday afternoon, and I was emotionally exhausted from the week of testimony. Keith stood up and methodically walked through every piece of evidence, connecting Nathan's actions into a clear pattern of predatory stalking. He reminded the jury about the GPS tracker, the back-end access, the multiple victims with identical stories, the decoy operation that proved Nathan was still actively hunting for me despite court orders. Keith's voice was measured and factual as he explained how Nathan had turned stalking into a profitable business by selling tracking capabilities to other abusers. He asked the jury to consider what kind of person does that, what kind of person terrorizes multiple women over years, and then profits from helping others do the same. Nathan's lawyer gave an emotional closing about mental health and mistakes, claiming Nathan's actions came from a place of pain, not malice. She asked the jury to consider that Nathan had never physically harmed anyone and suggested prison time was too harsh for someone who just loved too much. Her argument felt hollow after weeks of evidence showing systematic stalking and calculated abuse. The judge gave instructions to the jury about the specific charges and legal standards they needed to apply. Then the jury filed out to begin deliberations, and I was sent home to wait. Camilla drove me back to the apartment, and I collapsed on the couch, completely drained from reliving everything in such detail. My mom stayed with us that night, and we ordered takeout, but I could barely eat. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, terrified it would be news about the verdict. The waiting felt impossible, like time had stopped and I was stuck in this awful limbo, where Nathan's fate and my safety hung in the balance. The call came at 11:47 a.m. on Saturday morning. Sloane's voice was steady, but I could hear the urgency underneath when she told me the jury had reached a verdict, and we needed to get back to the courthouse within the hour. I grabbed my jacket and Camilla drove us downtown, her hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough that her knuckles went white. The courthouse lobby was packed with people from both sides, and I kept my eyes down as we walked past Nathan's mother, who was crying into a tissue. Sloan met us at the courtroom entrance and squeezed my shoulder before we went inside. She leaned close and whispered that 4 hours was actually a good sign, because it meant the jury had enough evidence to work through and didn't need days of debate. I sat between Camilla and my mom in the gallery, while Nathan sat at the defense table looking pale and thin in his suit. The jury filed in, and none of them looked at Nathan, which Sloan later told me was another positive indicator. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the 4-person stood up with a piece of paper. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The 4-person read guilty for felony stalking, guilty for unauthorized computer access, guilty for identity theft, guilty for violating a protective order, guilty on every single count. Nathan's face went completely white, and he grabbed the edge of the table like he might fall over. His mother let out a loud sob behind me, and his lawyer put her hand on his arm. I felt Camilla grab my hand and squeeze it hard, and I realized I was shaking. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later, and then it was over. We stood up as the judge left, and Nathan was led out through the side door by 2 officers. I watched him go and felt something lift off my chest that I'd been carrying for almost a year. Sentencing day arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in late November. I wore the same outfit I'd worn for my testimony because my therapist said familiar things could help with anxiety. Keith had prepared me for what to expect, but sitting in that courtroom waiting for Nathan to be brought in still made my stomach turn. The judge entered and everyone stood, and then Nathan was escorted in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked smaller somehow, like the verdict had physically shrunk him. The judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, and Nathan stood up. He apologized to me and to the other victims, and said he knew now that what he did was wrong and he wanted to get help. It sounded rehearsed and empty. Then the judge started talking, and her voice was cold and sharp. She said Nathan had demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior that showed complete disregard for the safety and autonomy of multiple women. She talked about how he'd abused technology to terrorize people, and then profited by selling that same capability to other abusers. She said his actions represented exactly the kind of calculated stalking that the law was designed to punish. Then she sentenced him to 5 years in state prison with credit for the time he'd already served, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She added that he was prohibited from using rideshare platforms for life, and required to register as a cyberstalker. Nathan's mother started crying again, but I just felt numb and relieved. 2 officers came forward and led Nathan away in handcuffs, and he didn't look back at anyone. I walked out into the courthouse hallway, and finally let myself cry. Not from sadness, but from the pure relief of knowing he couldn't reach me anymore. The local news had cameras set up outside the courthouse, and a reporter approached me as we were leaving. Sloan nodded that it was okay, and I found myself standing in front of a microphone talking about the case. The reporter asked how I felt about the verdict, and I said I hoped it would prevent other victims from suffering the way I had. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and I talked about the need for better rideshare safety measures and stronger laws around technology-based stalking. The story ran that evening with clips of my statement and references to the investigative article that had been published months earlier. Within days, both rideshare companies issued press releases announcing they were implementing the safety features they'd promised in the settlement. Sloan's phone started ringing with calls from advocacy groups asking if I'd be willing to speak at safety awareness events. She passed along 3 requests, and I told her I'd think about it after I had some time to process everything. I took 2 weeks off work immediately after the trial ended. My boss approved it without question and told me to focus on taking care of myself. I spent the first few days sleeping more than I had in months, like my body was finally catching up on all the rest it had missed during the constant stress. My therapist scheduled extra sessions that week, and we worked through the complicated feelings that came with the verdict. She helped me understand that relief and residual fear could exist at the same time, and that being angry about the year Nathan had stolen from my life was completely valid. We talked about how trauma doesn't just disappear when the threat is removed, and that healing would be a process, not a single moment. By the end of the second week, I was sleeping through the night without waking up to check the locks. My appetite came back, and I actually enjoyed meals again instead of forcing myself to eat. I started going for walks around the neighborhood without constantly looking over my shoulder. When I returned to work, my boss called me into her office on my first day back. She told me the company was granting me a flexible schedule with the option to work from home 2 days a week for as long as I needed it. She said they recognized the toll the past year had taken and wanted to support my continued recovery. Then she said something that made me tear up. She told me privately that she was impressed by my strength and my job performance throughout the entire ordeal, and that I'd handled everything with remarkable professionalism. I thanked her and felt something shift inside me, like maybe I could start rebuilding the professional confidence that Nathan had tried to destroy. Over the next few weeks, I settled into the new routine and found that having control over my schedule helped me feel more stable. I could schedule therapy appointments without using sick time, and I could work from home on days when I felt overwhelmed by being around too many people. Gianna and I met for coffee in early December and talked about channeling our experiences into something productive. She'd been thinking about starting an advocacy organization focused specifically on technology-based stalking, and asked if I wanted to co-found it with her. I used part of my settlement money to cover the initial costs of registering as a nonprofit and setting up a website. We created resources for victims trying to navigate the legal system, including templates for documenting evidence and guides for working with law enforcement. We reached out to legislators about strengthening laws around GPS tracking and data privacy. The work felt meaningful in a way that helped me transform what had happened into something that could actually help other people. We called it Safe Connections, and within the first month, we'd already helped 3 victims file police reports and connect with lawyers. Gianna handled most of the public-facing work while I focused on the resource development, and the partnership felt natural and healing. 3 months after Nathan's sentencing, I was walking to my car alone for the first time since everything happened. I'd parked in a public garage downtown after a Safe Connections meeting, and I was feeling good, almost normal. Then I saw an unfamiliar package sitting on my windshield with no return address or markings. My heart started racing immediately, and all the old fear came flooding back. I stepped away from the car and pulled out my phone with shaking hands. I called Sebastian instead of touching the package, and he told me to wait where I was. An officer arrived within 10 minutes and carefully examined the package while I stood 20 feet away trying to control my breathing. He opened it and pulled out a stack of glossy advertisements from a car dealership having a sale. Just marketing materials that someone had probably stuck on every car in the garage. The officer was kind about it and told me I'd done exactly the right thing by calling instead of touching it. I drove home feeling stupid for panicking, but my therapist told me later that I should be proud of myself for following safety protocols instead of either ignoring my instincts or spiraling into full panic. 6 months after Nathan went to prison, I met someone through the advocacy work. He'd reached out about his sister who was dealing with a stalker, and we'd talked on the phone several times about resources. He asked if I wanted to get coffee, and I said yes before I could overthink it. We met at a cafe near my apartment, and I was honest about everything that had happened over the past year. He listened without judgment and told me his sister's situation had made him much more aware of how common stalking was and how poorly the system handled it. It didn't turn into a relationship, and we only went out twice before mutually deciding we were better as friends. But the fact that I could be open and vulnerable with someone new felt like a huge milestone in my healing. I could actually imagine dating again someday without Nathan's shadow hanging over everything. A year after Nathan's arrest, I was living in my own apartment with security systems that I controlled, working a job I genuinely loved, and helping other stalking victims find justice through Safe Connections. I still had moments of checking over my shoulder when I heard footsteps behind me on the street. I still felt my heart race sometimes when I saw a car that looked like Nathan's old vehicle. The hypervigilance probably wasn't going away completely, and my therapist said that was normal for trauma survivors. But those moments were manageable now, and they didn't control my daily life anymore. Nathan had 4 more years left in prison, and by the time he got out, I'd have built a life so solid and protected that he could never touch it again. I was surrounded by people who actually respected my boundaries and supported my choices. Camilla was still my closest friend, and my mom called every Sunday to check in. The support group had become a real community. I wasn't the same person I'd been before all of this happened, and I never would be. But I was stronger and more aware of red flags, and genuinely happy with the future I was creating completely on my own terms. So yeah, that's the story. Nothing overproduced, just me talking to you. Thanks for hanging out. It really feels like a quick chat between friends. We'll do it again soon.